Hello, Blue Valley. This is Mr. Hume, librarian at Blue Valley Middle School, with another of our First Chapter Fridays. And today I'm going to be reading you the first chapter of a book called Mike, which is a pretty interesting concept of a book, a little bit unusual, a little bit original, kind of a sports book, but hopefully one I think you'll enjoy. So sit back, listen up, and let me read the first chapter of this to you. Mike by Andrew Norris. Floyd bounced the ball to the ground 3 times, held it to his racket for a moment, and then threw it into the air in a move that he'd practiced at least 100 times a day for the last 8 years. His body lifted onto his toes, he swung the racket back up and slammed the ball toward the far side of the court. As he did so, a movement to his right caught his eye. It was only a momentary distraction, but it meant the ball was a half-inch lower in the air when the racket struck it, and instead of skimming over the net, it grazed the canvas webbing and deflected fractionally upward before landing back in the court. "Net," called the umpire. "First service." Floyd took the second ball from his clip around his waist and glanced up at the spectators. What he saw didn't entirely surprise him. It was Mike, of course. He was walking along the top row of the tiered seating, his ankle-length black coat billowing behind him in the breeze, and then he turned and began moving down the steps. Spectators are not supposed to walk around in the stands while the game is in progress. Once a match is started, they stay in their seats and don't move because moving will distract the players. Bouncing the ball a few times, Floyd decided to wait. Presumably, Mike wanted to sit in one of the rows lower down, where he would be closer to the action, and there was no point trying to continue the game until he had settled. Mike walked all the way down to the steps, but to Floyd's surprise, instead of finding himself a seat, he opened the gate and the barrier that surrounded the court and walked over to the umpire's chair. "When you're ready, Mr. Beersford," called the umpire. Clearly, he hadn't noticed Mike, who was now standing a little behind and beneath him. Floyd pointed with his racket. "You've got a visitor," he said. The umpire frowned. "Is something wrong, Mr. Beersford?" "Yes," said Floyd, still pointing at Mike. "Him." The umpire's frown deepened, and he glanced down at Mike before looking back at Floyd. I don't quite understand." "Well, I can't play while he's on the court, can I?" Floyd wondered why the umpire was being so slow. "Could you ask him to leave, please?" There was a restive murmuring among the spectators, but the umpire made no move to get Mike to leave. His fingers hovered uncertainly over the scoring pad as he looked around. Floyd's father came onto the court, a look of concern on his face as he walked over to his son. "What is it?" he asked. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," said Floyd, "except that I can't play with him there, can I?" "Who?" "Him." Floyd pointed at Mike. "Why does everyone seem to think that someone walking onto the court in the middle of a match doesn't matter?" Over by the umpire, Mike carefully studied the sky before turning to face Floyd. "Why don't we go for a walk," he said, "by the sea?" "I am not going for a walk," Floyd told him firmly. "I am playing tennis. Now, would you please just go away?" "I didn't say anything about going for a walk," said his father. "I'll be happy to go away as soon as you tell me what's wrong." "I wasn't talking to you," said Floyd. A part of his mind was trying to work out why everyone was behaving so strangely. "I was talking to Mike." "Mike, you mean he's here?" Floyd's father looked sharply around the court. "Where?" "There," Floyd pointed. "He's standing right over there." His father looked at the umpire's chair and then all around the court. "I'm sorry," he said eventually, "but I can't see anyone." But, Floyd blinked. How could his father not see Mike? He was standing only a few yards away, wasn't he? What did he mean he couldn't see him? A small tremor of alarm ran through his body as he stared at the figure that apparently no one else could see. "It's all right," Mike smiled as he raised a hand in a gesture of reassurance. "Nothing to worry about. I'm a friend." "What is it?" Mrs. Beersford had followed her husband onto the court. "What's happening?" "He says he can see Mike," said Mr. Beersford in a low voice as he pointed to the umpire's chair. "Over there." Mrs. Beersford looked in the direction her husband was pointing and frowned. "But there's nobody there." "Yes, there is," Floyd protested. "There's Mike." "All right, old fellow," Mr. Beersford put an arm around his son's shoulder. "Let's call it a day, shall we?" "No," said Floyd. "I don't want to call it a day. I'm playing tennis." "No, you're not. Not this afternoon. Come along." Mr. Beersford took his son by the arm. "We're going home," and he led his son gently from the court. It wasn't quite the ending to the tournament that any of them had planned. Floyd's parents took him to Altrincham House, a private hospital on the outskirts of Sheffield that specialized in sports injuries. Floyd had been there before on several occasions, with problems ranging from a torn neck muscle to a chipped ankle bone, and Dr. Willis, who ran the facility, greeted them like old friends. Although it was 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening when they arrived, he was waiting for them in reception and ushered them straight through to his office. One end of the office was furnished with two enormous leather sofas facing each other on either side of the fireplace, and he motioned Mr. and Mrs. Beresford to one of the sofas while sitting himself next to Floyd on the other. "Your father gave me the broad picture on the phone," he said as a nurse brought in a tray of coffee and sandwiches and placed them at the table in front of him. "But you'd better fill me in on the details. What happened exactly?" Floyd explained how he had been playing the last match of a 3-day under-18s tournament at Scarborough when Mike had appeared. "He was winning the thing, hands down," put in Mr. Beresford. "He'd won the first set 6-2, and he was up 5-1 in the second and serving for the match." "So," Dr. Willis turned back to Floyd, "you were all set to chalk up another Beresford victory when the Invisible Man appeared." "He wasn't invisible to me," said Floyd. "No," Dr. Willis helped himself to a sandwich. "How did he do it? Appear?" "He was just there," said Floyd. "I saw him walking along the top of the stand, then he came down the steps. I waited because I thought he was just looking for somewhere to sit down, but he came out on the court and stood there by the umpire. Couldn't understand why someone didn't tell him to leave. It wasn't until Dad came over that I realized that no one else could see him." Dr. Willis nodded sympathetically as he finished the sentence. "That must have been quite alarming for you." "Yes," said Floyd, "it was a bit. I take it from the fact that you knew his name that you've seen this Mike person before." "Yes, several times." Floyd found himself sweating slightly. Dr. Willis's questions were gently put, but made him realize how strange all of this must have seemed to anyone else. Indeed, how very strange it all was. "And when you saw him before, what sort of things would he be doing?" "He'd be watching mostly, you know. I'd see him standing in the crowd while I was playing, and he'd be watching." "Had he ever spoken to you before?" "A couple of times," said Floyd, "but that was when I was practicing on my own." "And he seemed quite normal?" "Yes. I never understood why he was there, but he always looked perfectly real." Dr. Willis sipped thoughtfully at his coffee. "Interesting." "What do you think it is?" asked Mrs. Beresford nervously. "Well, that's what we have to find out, isn't it?" Dr. Willis put down his cup. "I think it would be best if Floyd stayed here tonight, and we'll run some tests on him tomorrow. But I'll give him a quick check over now, if that's all right. Make sure there's nothing urgent to attend to." He stood up. "He won't be more than a few minutes." Dr. Willis took Floyd through a door at the far end of his office and led to a consulting room, where a nurse with a clipboard was already waiting. He gestured to Floyd to take a seat on the examination couch and stood in front of him. "Just a few questions to start with," he said. "Any headaches recently?" "No," said Floyd. "Blurred vision?" "No." "Aches and pains in the muscles?" The doctor probed with his fingers at the glands under Floyd's jaw. "No." "Any trouble sleeping at night?" "No." "Are you taking drugs?" The question took Floyd rather by surprise. "No," he said. "Never." "I don't mean just recreational drugs." Dr. Willis looked carefully at Floyd as he spoke. "A lot of athletes know that certain chemicals will enhance their performance in some way. Have you been experimenting with anything like that?" "No," Floyd said. "Absolutely not." "Sensible fellow." Dr. Willis smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, in that case, we just go back and finish those sandwiches while Janice here sorts out a bed for you." "Thank you," said Floyd. "Can is it serious?" Dr. Willis put an arm on his patient's shoulder as he steered him toward the door. "I think anything that puts you off your tennis is extremely serious, but I don't think you need to worry too much. Whatever the trouble is, we're here to sort it out, and we're rather good at that sort of thing. All you have to do is make sure you get a decent night's sleep." Dr. Willis had the knack of making people believe what he said. It was one of the reasons that Altrincham Clinic was such a success, and Floyd left the consulting room reassured that whatever the problem was, Dr. Willis would find a solution, and that then everything would be all right. Okay, so that's the first chapter of Mike. If you want to find out more about who the mysterious Mike character is, come check it out at the library, and we'll be happy to send you on your way with it. Thanks for listening.